right. Welcome to another episode of the Great Retention. Seth, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Glad to be here. Thanks, John.
Yeah, awesome. Well, looking forward to diving in all things employee experience. I know that you have a lot of background in this space. And to kick us off, right? So, for our audience, people first leaders, whether this is a CEO, CHRO, everything in between, wanting to, elevate, how we approach employee experience, engagement, retention, all of these topics, right? As we're heading into a new year. So, but give us context. Would love to learn just a little bit about your leadership role, the work that you're doing, but also Chronosphere as an organization. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm the head of employee experience for Chronosphere. Chronosphere is a cloud native data observability platform. We are a little under 300 employees at the moment, spread across the globe. So we have employees across the US, we have employees in Canada, all across Europe, and then actually some team members in Australia now. We have 3 hub offices, which are in New York, Seattle, and Vilnius, Lithuania. But for the most part, all of our employees are remote. So we really define ourselves as a remote first company, meaning the default mode of working for most of our team members is going to be remote in some capacity. But, like I said, we have hub offices and we do offer co-working memberships because we really value that flexibility for employees and being able to choose where they work best.
Got it. Okay. So global employee footprint, a little under 300 employees, remote first.
Yeah.
And leading employee experience for Chronosphere. So yeah, appreciate that context. So for a global company that is remote first, tell us a little bit about the culture at Chronosphere, and tell us, what does this mean to you as a leader, but also, what does that look like at Chronosphere?
Yeah, and let me actually back up and give a little bit of context about my role and what we oversee. So employee experience has become a sort of wide umbrella for a lot of different things. And I think depending on the company or the person, it's probably going to have some different functions that fall in there. So specifically for Chronosphere, my team's responsible for remote experience, in-place experience, engagement. So we run all of our engagement surveys, internal communication. So that the all hands, our company, our intranet, our wiki, and then building out the playbooks that support those things and give people, sort of an idea of the best practices. So that's really, along with DEI and employee resource groups, those are all the things that my team sort of is responsible for and supporting and managing. As far as culture at Chronosphere, it's really interesting because when I was in the process of looking for a new role, what really drew me to Chronosphere was, one, I thought they had a very progressive, at the time, very progressive outlook on remote first, right? The past few years have kind of, just from the data I've gleaned and from a lot of the work I've done, I sort of formed the thought in my head that I think remote is going to be, it's going to grow in the future. And I do think this will, at least hybrid, will be the default mode of working for most organizations going forward in the future. I don't see us returning to a 5-day-a-week workplace. And so I wanted to be part of an organization that prioritized that. The fact that they were, even at their size, thinking about this role showed me that they valued employee experience and engagement. And that's something they wanted to, they had a great culture in place, but that was something they were very cognizant about keeping as they scaled and as they grew. And so when I started, that, the first thing I noticed was it was a very welcoming, inviting environment, right? I started virtually like most of our employees do, went through onboarding, and, it's always funny to me, like, when you start a role in person, I think it's really easy to build those relationships. You're meeting with people in person. You're typically, most of the people you work with are going to be in the same office. This wasn't the case, but I never felt disconnected from the first moment. I think the people team, which is the team I'm under, and just the wider organization, was very good about reaching out and setting up time. And it was a very sort of welcoming environment. And the one thing, it was a very values-driven culture. And I'll get into values and a lot of the work we did in that in a bit. But I think those are the things that really drew me to the company, was just from my own philosophy and the things that I believe very strongly in. It aligned with a lot of the things that they were doing already. So,
yeah, no, that's I would say most leaders I talk to, like max 3 days a week when it comes in terms of coming in the office, right? And so, I'd say hybrid, definitely seeing that more and more, but a lot of companies, especially in tech,
Yeah.
because there's efficiencies, but, I know even for our team, when we do bring everyone together, that's some of the best feedback we get. So there is still that need for connection, that
Absolutely.
need to create, authentic relationships. Right. And so one of the things you said that I want to dig into a little bit further is you said, even though it was a remote first environment, you felt this like genuine welcoming. Right. So talk to us, because I feel like this is something that just a lot of organizations, leaders, it's just a struggle, right? It's just a challenge. You have to be totally honest, right? So tell us a little bit about that. What does that look like? How have you guys approached that? Any kind of examples or things that you can share when it comes to how do you create that welcoming environment in a remote first setting?
Yeah, I think the first is being very thoughtful and intentional about the onboarding and how you're onboarding people. And so even just in my onboarding cohort, where I didn't have anybody from my own team, just getting to know people and, the emphasis on setting up time with people outside of that. And they were very intentional and cognizant of, look, we are remote. So it is about setting up time with people as much as possible, getting to know people. We also do we are remote first, but we do a pretty regular cadence of offsites. So we bring teams together. And like you said, I think you stated it well, there are benefits to being remote, right? You get the flexibility, you get the choice. And I think it's good for parents and I think it's good from a diversity standpoint. We're tapping into talent markets that maybe tech wasn't really looking at previously. But that being said, it's very hard to replicate that in-person connection when you bring people together, when you get people in a room, when you're able to brainstorm and just bounce ideas of each other. It's very hard to do that consistently in a virtual setting. And so I think for us, it's about, we found a good balance in giving people that choice. So we've got options for them. They can go to the office, they can go to co-working space, they can work remotely, but we're also very cognizant about bringing teams together. And when we do bring teams together, maximizing the time we get together. So being very intentional and thoughtful. And then we do a regular cadence of just social events, just getting teams together on a local scale. So whether it's in New York, whether it's Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, where we have these pockets of employees that sort of, we're seeing a larger number of populations of employees in those cities. We want to bring them together on a regular basis just for social interaction, just to get people together. So, I've said for the past couple of years, I think remote, hybrid, in-person, all of this is going to be messy for the next few years. But I think the companies that are tackling this problem now are going to have the most success. And I think the companies that are heavily resistant to any mode that isn't 5 days a week in office, I think they're going to have some challenges with it when it comes to retaining talent and acquiring talent.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So with the role of employee experience at Chronosphere, I mean, are you guys, so love the idea of like regional gatherings, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I've got pockets, I've got 10 folks here, and it's like is that something that you facilitate as an employee experience leader, or is that like you're empowering them to do that? Like how, like, I know that's a tactical question, but
no, that's a great point. And it's part of the, the overall program we built. Like we don't want to be the gatekeepers of people getting together, right? So it is about empowering employees, but like we are that sort of connector to it, right? Where if, we own the budget for that kind of thing. And so we're working with local team members. So we're not just deciding in a vacuum, like, hey, we're going to have everybody go to here on this day. We're working with our stakeholders in those cities to say, well, we're pulsing people. What do you think would be a good event? Like, what are you guys interested in doing? So again, we don't want to be the gatekeepers or blockers to that, but there's got to be an overarching program of it. It can't just be sort of a free for all, because you've got budgets and costs and things like that you got to consider. But that's sort of the model we adopted, where we want to give them the tools to support. It's very similar to the way we've built our employee resource group program. We want to give people the tools and support and the structure, but like, it's, I think part of the amazing thing about the culture at Chronosphere is it is a homegrown culture, and we want employees to retain that.
Right. It has to be organic.
Yes.
It can't. So totally get that. But I think it's worth noting that there's a budget that's been allocated, right?
Yeah.
For this specifically. Right. And then there's pulsing. So you're actually, it sounds like at some sequence gathering feedback in terms of, how people want to stay, connected and so forth. And then there's a budget to do that. So there is some intentional thought that has gone into hey, we're going to make this an important part of
Yeah,
our culture, right?
definitely. And I think it goes back to, I see this with when I talk to peers at other companies where like when you go to remote or hybrid model, typically they're thinking very much about like bringing two people together for work related. So I guess on sites would be the word. They're bringing people together to connect around work. And I think one thing that gets lost in that is a big part of culture building that I've seen, and this is even pre-pandemic in the office, are just those sort of like spur of the moment. Hey, let's all go out tonight. Let's go grab lunch, or let's go out and eat. Like that's a big part of building bonds and relationship with people. So you have to me, you've got to find a way, whether it's remote or not, to give opportunity to have those social moments, those social connections be created.
Totally agree. And you mentioned during your onboarding, there was an emphasis on just spending time with folks, right?
Yeah.
And so, I may be more willing to just do those spontaneous, whatever interactions if I've met you before. And so how do you guys talk to us? So onboarding is another challenge area that I hear very frequently, especially in a remote first environment. How have you guys approached this? It sounds like, again, very intentional, meeting people, creating, a schedule of how you're going to be introduced maybe to different departments, different roles. And so tell us a little bit how you guys have approached onboarding.
Yeah. So one thing we do, and I think you'll see this a lot with smaller tech companies, and I've done this previously, is we have what's called donuts, which are these little, you're familiar. Yeah. So it pops up in Slack. I love that because whenever I start a company, that's a great way just to get to know people, to put random time on people's calendars. It's very easy in a remote environment to get sort of siloed in terms of that connection with just your team, right? Because you're by default, you're going to be having a lot of calls with your team. You're going to be getting to learn them. You're going to, get to know your immediate stakeholders and the partners. But there's this wider part of the company that you may not have those work touch points with. And to me, like things like donuts are a great way to get to know people that you don't have a consistent touch point with. But beyond that, I think it's being in a virtual environment. It doesn't mean you're necessarily isolated. And so I think you've got your onboarding cohort you start with, and really to me, the best part, the most important part of onboarding is those first couple of days and getting people immersed in the culture, learning the values, learning the sort of broad things that affect the company, that are sort of across the company. And then you kind of dive more into the things that are specific to your role and your team. But, just being able to set up time with people. And that's one of the things I emphasize with team members is like, reach out to people, set up time, throw time on the calendars. We all have each other's Google Calendar. Like there's no reason you can't do that. I mean, obviously you want to be cognizant of time zones, and we're across distributed time zones, but I think it's just about encouraging people and letting them know, hey, this is part of the culture, meeting people, reaching out to people, and then conversely encouraging team members to always welcome the new team members. And that like we are, putting it on Slack when somebody starts and everybody's kind of, it's those little sort of things that I think go a long way with welcoming people.
Got it. And so, it sounds like you, and I know a lot of other tech companies, heavy Slack shop, right? And Donuts, an app that basically pairs, I guess, random folks together to spend whatever, 15, 20 minutes, just getting to know one another. And so this is something that's just part of like all employees are part of this. It sounds like.
Exactly. It's not mandatory. You know what I mean? When you start, you're put into it, and you can obviously opt out of it. But yeah, it is something when you start that is available.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Very cool. Love the idea of just connecting people outside of their own, department and kind of, just work zone. So totally makes sense. So, okay. So, the other, question, that I wanted to, really kind of get your feedback on here, Seth, is, so when it comes to employee, 2023, especially in tech, it's been a tough environment for a lot of companies, right? Sure. So we've gone through layoffs. There's been, budget freezes, you name it, right? Macro conditions. And the knee-jerk reaction can be, hey, like we're going to pull back. Employee experience sounds great when times are well, but right now we got to focus on X, right? Like that's maybe, what someone who doesn't understand the value or the ROI of employee experience. So talk to me, and I'm kind of teeing this up because I know Chronosphere is a very, data oriented company, but talk to me about how you show the value for employee experience within the organization. How do you, make this a data driven strategy, as you guys are moving forward? So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, I wouldn't say we're not overly heavy with surveys, but we do a lot of surveys. We do a biannual cadence of a larger engagement survey, and then we'll do pulse surveys, which are typically targeted for specific initiatives, or if we want to get data around a certain topic, that kind of thing. And then we do an annual benefits survey as well, where we dive deep into the benefits. But what I always like to remind people is, we talk about Maslow's hierarchy, right? And how Maslow's hierarchy affects employee experience. And when you think about that, right, it's really easy to look at employee experience in terms of like those perks and those bells and whistles and the events and all of that stuff. But there's actually things that I think are more important to that if you're not tackling those and you're not solving for those, it doesn't matter how much you're going to have on the perk side or the event side. And those are things like do people feel like they're fairly compensated? Do people feel like they have agency and choice at work? Autonomy? Do they feel like they have a good relationship with their manager and their peers, and they've got two-way communication with their managers? So, I think to me, employee experience doesn't have to suffer because of budget constraints, right? Like there's things that factor into creating employee engagement, creating employee satisfaction, which aren't necessarily budget driven. And I think that's where the survey comes into play, right? So we've done a good job of sort of templatizing our engagement survey statements that are pretty standard, right? And those are things that are centered around your relationship with your manager. Are you getting regular feedback? Do you feel like your job performance is evaluated fairly? Do you feel like people from all backgrounds are treated fairly? So we have questions around DEI. So we have that sort of templatized statements where we can look at comparison data between the engagement surveys, but then we'll also add questions to those around things that we're looking to explore a little bit more closely for that go around. So for example, this previous one we did in the fall, we wanted to dive in a little bit deeper on our meeting culture and all hands. And do people think we have a good, an appropriate cadence and frequency of all hands? Do they feel like they're getting useful information from that? Do they feel like they're having an appropriate cadence of departmental meetings? Do they feel like they get the updates they need when they need them? Because to me, communication is a big thing. And I've seen this at other companies where if the communication is lacking, if people feel like their time's being wasted, that's going to adversely affect engagement more than, not having large events or social, you know what I mean? Like those are the things that are going to frustrate people and really create, poor engagement. So I think we've done a good job of that and creating that sort of standard for what the statements are in the engagement, but then also looking at things from H1 to H2 in terms of like, what are some areas we need to dive into deeper?
Yeah. And I love what you said about Maslow's hierarchy. It's I think, taking a step back, it's like you said, the fundamentals, right, have to be in place in order for you to build on, in order for you to get value out of some of the, we'll call it higher end, perks or whatever they might be. And so the way that you are, I guess, ensuring that fundamentals are in place is you're using that pulse, right? And so in addition to the cadence of engagement, feedback, you're mixing in I guess different questions based on any initiatives that you might be focusing on the upcoming quarter, what have you. Makes a ton of sense. Totally, totally on the same page. So I appreciate you sharing that insight. I haven't heard it in that way, but I totally get it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So on this note of remote first, of kind of welcoming, onboarding, of making sure that the fundamentals are in place. I know previously we talked about a remote first playbook, right? So an actual playbook that you give to people. Yeah. So tell me what this is. Help me understand. Like you're giving me a guide, a manual. What are you giving me? Tell me about it.
No, it's a great question. This has sort of evolved over time. This is kind of when I started, one of the first things I talked about with our head of people, in terms of a project that I think, so, throughout the pandemic, we heard all these new phrases: remote first, hybrid, all of these things, right? And I think they mean something different for each company because it's the way the company defines their policies around those things. For us, we're very clear about remote first means remote is our default mode of working. So most of our employees will be remote, but we wanted to go beyond that, right? So we wanted to dive into like a little bit deeper on what our philosophy on remote is. What are the supporting pillars? And so we came up with 4 sort of philosophical pillars for how we operationalize or think of remote work. And that's flexibility, right? We want to give employees choice. We want to give them agency, autonomy, the ability to choose how, where they work best. Clear and consistent communication. We're remote. We're not in person. We're spread across time zones. Communication is crucial to us to keep people aligned. And not just communication, but leveraging asynchronous communication, right? We're not all in the same time zones. We don't want people to we don't want work-life balance to suffer. We want to be very cognizant of that. So how can we leverage these 1,000,001 tools for asynchronous communication in a way that's going to keep people aligned? Support and enablement. So it's not just enough to let people work flexibly remotely. You got to give them the tools to do that properly. So if they're at home, they need a home setup, right? If there's somebody who just doesn't work well at home, I saw this at previously my old company. New York is one of those markets where most people live in smaller offices, right? Or smaller apartments. Going to the office is going to be a much better way of working. So support and enablement pillar is really around giving people the tools for that. And then it's the 4th pillar is that connection piece, connection and camaraderie. So finding those moments, whether virtually, in person, to bring people together and create that connection, that culture. And so that's kind of the first thing we started with when we were building this playbook. So we just wanted to outline what our philosophy was, what those pillars were. And then from there, we started building out just best practices from everything from around how to maintain work-life balance, how to create these sort of guardrails around your day where you're not just constantly working and you've got that work-life harmony, to best practices for managers, advice for managers, how to to manage a team remotely and virtually for performance issues, things like that. So it's kind of evolved over time to this sort of all-encompassing guide of how we, not only philosophically how we view remote work and why it's important, but also how to operationalize that and give people those best practices. And originally, my intention around it was for new hires, right? Because I thought this is going to be a great way to introduce new people to this culture. Not everybody's been in a remote first environment, especially, a year ago or a little over a year ago when I started here. These concepts are still a little bit new. So we wanted it for new hires. And then as I'm building it, I'm like, no, I think there's a lot here that actually apply to managers as well and helping managers manage their teams virtually and remotely. And then even, I've worked with some of our TA team just in terms of like being able to give snippets of that to candidates so they know what they're getting into when they are going to a remote first company. But yeah, I mean, I literally just last month finished. So now we're incorporating, we have the playbook, but we're actually built a course around it for onboarding. So employees can go take this course via their onboarding path, and they can learn all of these, these tips, guides, best practices, philosophical points around remote working.
Yeah.
That was long-winded. I apologize.
No, it's great. Now I want to, so like, I'm going to put my more traditional hat on.
Yeah.
Do I think of this as an employee handbook or is it something different? Right.
Yeah. Definitely different because we have an employee handbook. And to me, employee handbook is more around, the policies, really understanding the policies from an HR standpoint and just the things that affect kind of every employee. This is geared specifically towards remote working and how we view it, how we think about it, how to operationalize it essentially.
Yeah. Love that you guys, have invested in this, and how this translates through your onboarding, all the way to manager training. And, a lot of people have never managed before, a team, let alone remote.
Yeah.
Right. And so I totally get it. Right. And it makes a lot of sense. Tip of the hat, to you and the team at Chronosphere for putting that in place, to help employees make this, transition into the organization. So love that. Seth, this has been awesome. Really appreciate you just coming on the show, just being an open book, sharing your experiences. One of the ways that we like to always wrap up is, just to get a lesson learned or a key takeaway or something that we can share with our audience that they can maybe just go in and just, implement inside of their team or their organization. So I know you mentioned about Maslow's hierarchy, but tell us, is there anything that kind of comes to mind as we wrap up here today that you can share as a takeaway?
I think, and this is just because I've been so close to this for the past few years now. And I've seen this done. And, what I'll say is the best thing I could call out right now for leaders is around whatever their policy is going to be around remote working, hybrid, in person. I think the most important thing is figuring out first what is necessary and important to your company to run your actual business. Then using looking at the data from employees, what are employees asking for? And whatever you decide, wherever you land, be very resolute in what that is, because we've seen this a lot with companies where they'll come out with a policy, they backtrack, and then that eventually just sort of weakens their stance in their employee eyes. So be very resolute in what it is and ensure that you're backing it up with data, and you're being very intentional and thoughtful about how you implement that. Because I think one thing it's easy to forget in this conversation of remote versus in-person as hybrid, is how much this affects people's lives and how much this affects employees' lives. And, I think that's the most important thing is you've just got to be very, you've got to be honed in on what your data is telling you and why you made that decision. It can't just be decided in a vacuum. Like, I think everybody should be back in the office, or I think everybody should be remote. There's got to be concrete data to back up that stance.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I know that we feel that alignment. If we can positively impact, the lives of people, employees' lives, that's going to impact the business to be successful. Yeah. So, Seth, thank you again for joining us on the Great Retention. So much respect for you, the Chronosphere as an organization and the work that you're doing, and just really appreciate you sharing your insights with us today.
No, absolutely, John. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.